Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Hearth. Today's story is bringing back one of my personal favorite characters, Ezekiel. For those of you who don't know who Ezekiel is, he was one of the main characters of the second story I ever wrote on my channel. This is a sequel to that one, although it doesn't necessarily require that you watch the first one in order to understand what's going on, but I will link the first video in the description in case any of you do feel the urge to go and see Ezekiel's backstory. Regardless of whether you watch the other video or not, pull up a seat, get your tea and your snacks out, and enjoy the story. Thank you for watching. Ezekiel stretched, climbing out of his massive bed. Stretching did him no good. He was no longer even capable of sleep, nor were there muscles or ligaments to benefit from the action. But decades of memory and habit were not easily forgotten, even all these centuries later. His bones clicked on the old wood as he made his rounds. There was no danger to patrol for, no risk of intruder, simply another habit. The house was as much of a ruin as it always was. Recently, he had considered rebuilding his estate. The magic still lay dormant in this house. It would be a simple task. But he never did. As simple as it would also be far too much of a risk. There was no explanation on earth that could reason away the crumbled house at the edge of town, suddenly repairing itself. People may steer clear of his home, but they weren't blind. He walked out to his garden, by far his favorite part of the home. He stared up at the sky, watching the clouds drift over and around the sun. Even when he was alive, he spent a great deal of time in this garden. It was a simultaneous reminder of his fondest memories and greatest regret. Although, in recent years, there had been some new additions to the former category. It had been a few years since they last came to visit, but he didn't mind. Nicholas and Serrana were growing up, and no doubt had much more pressing matters than spending time with a dusty old skeleton. Still, he cherished the two. They had brought him friendship, something he had not experienced for longer than he cared to admit. They had given him a sort of second chance, an opportunity to be a real friend this time around. He was quite looking forward to their next visit. He waved a hand, small orbs of light appearing at his fingertips. Hundreds of thousands of water droplets formed, pulled together by his magic, until the air above the garden sparkled. He let his hand fall, the improvised rain falling gently among the flowers. Satisfied that his garden was properly hydrated, he ventured back inside, pulling a mug from the cupboard. All but 3 of them were populated entirely by dust and cobwebs, as was the rest of his silverware. He pulled more water from the air, filling his mug. A box of dried tea leaves and blossoms, a gift from Serrana, sat next to the mugs, and he plucked a chamomile blossom from the box and dropped it in the cup. It was a simple matter to heat the cup with magic, and after a few minutes he held a steaming cup of tea. He took a satisfied sip. He had no need for food or drink, and he had long since lost his tongue, but some days he swore he could still taste it. Ezekiel had no idea where the tea went after he drank it, much to Nicholas's dismay, and he had long since stopped wondering. He made his way back to the garden, calmly watching the flowers and enjoying his tea. A small spark of magic caught his senses. Someone had triggered one of his markers. 2 more markers lit up in a familiar sequence. It seemed like he would need more tea. The mugs were ready and steaming by the time Nicholas and Serana made it to the garden. "Welcome back," Ezekiel raised his mug to them. "I've made tea." The Lich had to quickly set his mug aside to avoid scalding Serana, who nearly bowled him over with a hug. "I'm sorry it's been so long," she said, squeezing him. Ezekiel chuckled. "It's all right, Serana. I have all the time in the world, you know." He stood, facing them. "Now, let's see how much you've grown." The 2 of them were no longer children, that was for sure. The little ones who barely reached his waist now stood a mere foot shorter than him. Less in Nicholas's case. Both of them possessed physiques that told tales of hard work. Even their hands were calloused and rough, like a builder or a blacksmith. If he still possessed the means to do so, he would have raised an eyebrow. Perhaps, have those impatient little children who used to interrupt my stories become something respectable? Ezekiel teased. "We're mercenaries," Nicholas replied, then scratched his head, his face knotting as he tried to think. "No. Kind of? We do good things." Serana sighed. "We're a part of a group that gets hired out to do things like protect merchants, clear monster dens, and other things like that. Not really mercenaries, but we operate along the same kind of system. Sometimes we even get to help with stuff like rebuilding towns after monster attacks." "Freelancers of some sort, then." Ezekiel nodded, his pride swelling. He wondered if this was what it felt like to be a father, or at least an uncle. He had never taken any apprentices, nor sired any progeny, a choice he was quickly coming to regret the longer he knew these 2. Ezekiel's many stories were somewhat of a tradition. Whenever the siblings would visit, he would regale them about his past, some mythical beast he had come across, or some magical experiment that produced rather humorous results. It had been a long time since he had been on the listening end of the equation. Nicholas and Serana spent hours telling him of their travels, the things they had seen, the people they had met, and the battles they had fought. It was just before twilight when their stories finally came to an end. Ezekiel sat back, pondering. "It seems the world has changed quite a bit since I last saw it." He chuckled. "A kingdom of mages. Who would have thought?" He had to admit, the idea of that much magic knowledge in one place intrigued him. He would love to see a place like that. He turned to the siblings. "So, how long are you home?" "We leave tomorrow morning," Nicholas answered. "We're on our way to meet a client, and we took a few days to stop here and check in on everyone." "That's not terribly long." Ezekiel watched the flowers bend as a gentle breeze wound its way through the garden. For the first time in a very long time, he was curious. He wanted to know. He wanted to see exactly how much the world had changed. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to see what was beyond his garden. "Where is this client?" he asked. "It's the Duke of the region. He lives in a castle a few days' ride west from here." Ezekiel thought for a moment. "I think I'll go with you." The siblings stared at him in surprise. They looked at each other, then Serana cleared her throat. No offense, Ezekiel, but you're not exactly You're a 6.5-foot skeleton. We couldn't just bring you with us. Ezekiel sprang to his feet. A simple problem with an equally simple solution. I shall return shortly. He stepped inside and tapped his foot twice on the floor, which promptly opened up, allowing him to vanish into the basement. The siblings watched the hole, curious as to what the Lich's proposed solution was. After several minutes, Ezekiel stamped and clanked back up to the garden doorway, his cloak now draped over a full set of plate armor, a claymore strapped to his back. "See," he said, his voice muffled inside the helmet. "No one will know." The siblings stared in disbelief. Nicholas snorted, a tiny, quick snort, his upper lip just barely twitching. But it was enough. The siblings doubled over, laughing until they could barely stand. Ezekiel looked from Serana to Nicholas. "What?" he asked. "Will this not work?" Serana wiped tears from her eyes. How did you even put the armor on? Why do you just have a suit of armor lying around?" "It was a gift," Ezekiel replied. "Someone gave a suit of armor to a wizard?" Nicholas wheezed, trying to catch his breath. Ezekiel attempted to cross his arms, but the armor got in the way. After a few tries, he gave up, pushing open his visor. Will this suffice as a disguise or not? The visor clamped back down over his face, startling him and inciting another bout of laughter. Once the siblings had gotten themselves under control, they gave him a once-over. "You're going to have to keep the armor on for the entire trip," Nicholas pointed out. "Even the helmet. You can't take any of it off." "Not a problem," Ezekiel said. "Neither temperature nor the elements affect me, so staying in the armor will not pose any difficulties." Serana scratched her head. "What do we do if they find out you're undead? None of them are going to be very open to having a lich travel with them." "We simply have to keep that from happening," Ezekiel replied, fiddling with the visor. It slammed shut again. Perhaps that was for the best, anyway. He wasn't going to be opening it on this trip. Serana sighed, scratching her head. "What do you think, Nicholas?" Nicholas tilted his head. "Well, I mean, as long as he stays in the armor, we should be all right. This shouldn't be too long of a job. Besides, he's been holed up here this whole time. I would rather he goes out with us than by himself." "That's true." Serana sighed again. "All right, you can come with us. Just please be careful, Ezekiel." "Naturally. You don't have to worry about me. Go home and get some rest. I will meet you at the edge of town tomorrow." Nicholas chuckled. "I can't believe we're actually doing this." "You're the one who said we'll be fine," Serana said, and the three of them made their way through the house to the front. "I know, but it's so strange it's hilarious. We're bringing our lich friend on a job with us. What part of that doesn't sound strange?" "Quite right," Ezekiel said, pushing his visor up one last time. "But it's the strange things that make the best memories. Now go home. It's getting dark." "We're not kids anymore, Ezekiel," Nicholas said. "Don't worry about us." "You have several centuries before that happens," Ezekiel replied. The siblings waved one last goodbye and headed back towards town. Once they were well on their way, Ezekiel descended into the basement once again, tendrils of magic undoing the armor and pulling various dust-covered tools from every direction. Lamps that hadn't been used for over 100 years flickered to life, illuminating a vast workshop with several tables covered in various runes. He laid the armor on the center table, reaching toward a pile of magic crystals he had gathered. He could feel the excitement build in him. For the first time in well over a century, he had some work to do.